Cars make a lot of noise. Much of that isn't from the engine or even the road either, but actually from something called aeroacoustics. That's the phenomenon where air passing over an object makes noise. In this podcast, we'll be going through, first of all, why cars produce so much noise through this way, and second, how changing its geometry affects this noise production in the first place. To do that, we're looking at this paper here, which if I scroll up, you can see is the role of four-body topology on aerodynamics and aeroacoustics characteristics of square-back vehicles using computational aeroacoustics. This paper is open access, so you can find the link below if you want, and the DOI is at the top of the page on the left here. So let's jump into it. So in figure 1, we see the different geometries that these authors tested to begin with. So they are in effect simplified geometries of cars, and in particular square-back cars. Now, I should mention as well, in each one of these little geometries, the actual back of the geometry is cut off just so they can fit all of these on the same picture, but they do extend further back, and we'll see later the actual entire geometry of many of them. So anyway, what all this means is that the rear face of each car, it's a very flat square back, and that approximates things like hatchbacks. Now in the top row, we see one set of shapes, and these are more or less bricks with various amounts of rounding to the front edges. The top right is the familiar armored body, which even though it definitely doesn't look like a car, it still retains all the major aerodynamic features of a car and the major aerodynamic flow physics. The bottom row are effectively a second set of geometry. They are significantly more car-like in that the front is pointed, much like a car. Each geometry is pointed in a different amount, but they're all part of the same group, and we'll see later how this pointing affects the lift and downforce production. Now the top row differs from the bottom row in that the bottom row's slanted front face not only means that these geometries have a slanted front face, but the front edges of the typical A pillars are seen here as well, that you get on cars. So the A pillars on these geometries are highlighted in blue, and if you're not familiar with what a pillar is, the term of it, this is literally just the front edge of the car near the driver's head and the front passenger's head. And we'll see that this is very important when it comes to sound production as well. And actually, if you've seen some of our other car simulation videos on YouTube, that might not be so surprising that the A pillar is very important. Anyway, in addition to these features on these geometries, we see various colors on the bodies. The authors don't do a great job explaining what these colors are, but from their rough description, I think we can make it out. First of all, the green. So each one of these little green sections is the side window of each car. Then we have the light pink region, and that's the frame of the window. Then we have a little red square, and that's the side mirror. We'll see later that this side view mirror is very important when it comes to noise production. So the authors are testing 6 geometries to see how they produce noise and their general aerodynamic effects too. Now in figure 2, we see some more details about their geometries and setup. So from an accuracy point of view, the bottom right figure, so 2C, is the most important because this is the window section and the black dots represent the locations of pressure probes on this window that experiments were done on as well on this exact same geometry. So the experiments give us data that we can then use to determine how accurate their simulations are or not. So there's something to compare to, and those dots are very important because we'll get them later and compare the CFD2 as well to see if they match the experimental results or not. So that's very good. And the authors investigated how noise is produced on these geometries and the effect of the A-pillars by doing CFD on these geometries. And in figure 3, we see their CFD domain. So overall, it looks very good. One thing I really like is that they simulated the entire geometry. And that might sound weird, but often only the left half or the right half of the geometry will be simulated. The results will then be mirrored around that center plane to give the other half of the car. Now, to be perfectly honest, that's not a great approach for car geometries. That's because the flow over a car is highly unsteady, and perhaps, even more importantly, not instantaneously symmetrical either. What I mean by that is, if you take a snapshot in time, the flow, particularly in the wake, won't be the same on the left half compared to the right half. So if you simulate only one half of the car and then try to mirror it, the results aren't accurate, and for some simulations you can definitely still use those results, but here it's problematic. And the reason why I say that is because the authors are looking at noise, and noise is very different to simulate compared to just regular aerodynamics, and it's significantly more difficult too. And as we'll cover in a second, the lengths you have to go into do CFD to get even remotely accurate noise production is much more difficult than general aerodynamics like drag or downforce. So the fact that they're simulating the entire geometry is a very good sign here. Now, one thing that is a little bad from a realistic point of view is that the turbulence intensity of their simulation is 0.1%. What that tells us is that the fluctuations in the flow's velocity is only about 0.1%. And that might seem great, except it's not. And that's because in real life, when you're cruising down the highway with the windows down and even with the windows up as well, the turbulence intensity hitting the car is usually higher. And we've covered this in other podcasts, so I won't go into it too much here. But just quickly, the air and winds in real life, they fluctuate much more than 0.1%. And they're more around 5 to 10% quite easily, actually. Anyway, the reason why this is very low turbulence is, why that's bad here, is because we're dealing with noise again, and noise is very touchy. Just changing minor things and introducing minor differences can change the noise production. So for example, with the turbulence intensity, that will change how the flow over the vehicle is a little bit, and that will change noise a little bit too. But while it's not great that there is such a large difference between the real life turbulence and the turbulence used here, the authors actually chose this value very wisely. And that's because they need to validate the CFD. They need to know how accurate it is. And to do that, they need to use the experimental results that we talked about earlier. And in the experiments, the turbulence intensity was only 0.1%. And because noise is so sensitive to that, the authors matched it in their CFD, and that's a great thing. So well done to them. But now we come to something that kind of makes me wonder. So on page 1063, in this first paragraph here, they say that they set the height of the geometries off the ground so that the height of the incoming boundary layer is the same as the height it is raised up. This object. So in other words, they're saying that this object is above the boundary layer, and they say that they did this because it means that the boundary layer then has minimal effects on the geometry's flow characteristics. They then cite another paper to back that up, and that general idea sounds odd to me because boundary layers are the momentum fluid, and just raising something up so that the boundary layer isn't hitting the geometry doesn't mean that it won't affect the rest of the flow. They said that it changes minimally here, and I have a hard time believing that, so I actually read the paper they cited, and I can see how you can argue that doing that changes the flow minimally, but I wouldn't use that word. The reason why is because in that other paper that said that if you move a geometry above a boundary layer, this particular geometry as well, then it's not going to affect its flow physics. They found that moving a car geometry above the boundary layer helped preserve the general flow physics, but that doesn't mean that the other important features don't change. So for example, you could still get the same general features, but they evolve differently over time and change the pressures on the car. That then changes the forces. And just because you get the same general features, doesn't mean you get even similar forces. So for example, let's say you have a vortex, and if you squish it against the wall, that will affect how quickly it dies out. It will strain it and stress it, and it will change how it goes downstream and develops, and how it affects the rest of the flow too. Then if you compare that to if the vortex would just freely flow away without being squished, they still both form, but they change in terms of their dying out pattern. So the flow has now changed. You still get the same general flow features. So I think that's saying that moving the boundary layer below the geometry doesn't affect things very much or minimally isn't the best choice of words. And that other study showed that we still get the same general flow features, but from what I saw, that was about it. So there are a lot of other factors that could change and important factors too. But either way, here the authors kind of had to use this setup again because the experiments had that set up as well, so the validation data needs to match that. And I just think that their justification is not quite how I'd put it, but it's still, I can understand why they need to do that way anyway. So anyway, let's move on. So for their CFD, they had a fairly new approach. Instead of using something called RANS or URANS or even regular DES or some variation of that, they use something called SBES. What that stands for is Stress Blended Eddy Simulation. Now, it might seem like a weird name, but in essence, it's actually very much like DES. And that's because it's a combination of RANS and LES. And ideally, I say ideally because that is always what we'd like, and ideally we'd keep the RANS or URANS bit in the boundary layer flow, but then once we're out of the boundary layer, we switch to LES. And that approach might seem like DES as well, and it very much is in that respect, but the way it switches and triggers its use to switch to make it a little different to DES. So in fact, in a way, its goal is very much similar to DDS and IDDS. And for those who don't know what DDS is and IDDS is, they are variants of the typical DDS approach where they try to make the approach more robust so that you don't trigger the LES part in the boundary layer, you keep the RANs in the boundary layer. And that's what SBES tries to do as well. But none are completely successful. They are all just improvements in one way or another. Anyway, I thought that was quite interesting, that approach. And other research has shown that SBES is quite promising too. So anyway, let's now move on to their mesh setup. So they say that, if we come down here, they say that they kept the Y plus values below 1, which is good, because from what I can see, they used the K-Omega SSD turbulence model for the CFD, and so a Y plus value of 1 or around that is very good. And in table 1, we see the effects of 3 different levels of mesh refinement on the frequencies found at 5 different points on the side windows. So position 5, 10, 21, 27, and 33. From what I can tell, they don't give the number of cells for each mesh, but they do say that the medium grid had 25 million cells. And the results in table 1 are very interesting. I don't know how coarse the coarsest mesh was, but it shows that the frequencies measured at these 5 positions were around 50 to 60% different to the medium mesh, but then the differences between the medium and fine meshes were only about 1 to 2%. So they decided to go with the medium mesh, and that's always good. Let's now move on to the validation study because it's pretty good. So in figure 1, we got up to figure 1, we can see the frequencies, figure 6, we see the frequencies found between the experiments and the various CFD meshes. So here we go. Figure 6a is the complete frequency spectrum looked at, while figures 6b and 6c are little zoned sections of different frequencies. Anyway, in the bottom left corner of figure 6a, we can see the point that the frequencies correspond to in this graph. The little cross is the point we're looking at here. It's the bottom front of the side window. Now, as the authors say, there are 2 general peaks in figure 6a. They occur at 40 Hz and 80 Hz. The authors say that these are Aeolian tones, which means that they are steady tones, and so they're probably from some kind of sustained vortex shedding. And in fact, the authors actually say that if you calculate the Struhl number based on 40 Hz here, you get what you'd expect for a square cylinder. So I guess at the very least, the 40 Hz value is for the macroscopic vortex street, the von Karman street coming off of the object. And comparing the fine and medium results with the experiments, so the red and black lines with the orange circles, they're definitely very good in agreement with the trends. There is a little bit of discrepancy when it comes to the magnitudes though, but the CFD is a little bit lower, but the trends are pretty much bang on. So, but even so, I'd say that this CFD is pretty well validated here, even though there's a little bit of a discrepancy in the magnitude. And the results are very close to the experiments, and we can definitely trust the trends, and the actual values are pretty good too, just a little lower. So let's now jump to the results section. So in table 2, we see some very interesting results. So first of all, the leftmost column has various labels. The top 3 are for the geometries without A pillars. Those are really just the flat faces. Then the bottom 3 are for those with the A pillars. And if we scroll back to figure 1, we can just quickly remember what these labels are. So figure 1 up here, we have the top ones GB, FB, AB, the bottom ones SB, WB, HB. So back in table 2 here, there we go. So for the drag coefficient column, which is the second one here, something I'm a little surprised at is that there isn't much of a difference between the top 3 geometries and the bottom 3. I mean, the top 3 have a flat face just plowing through the air, while the bottom 3 have a much sleeker face slicing through the air. But still, they all give very similar drag coefficients. And I looked through the rest of the figures, and there aren't any streamlined pictures to see, like where the streamlines are going or anything like that. So I'm not sure exactly why all 6 geometries are giving similar trends. I guess that's just one of the mysteries of life. Anyway, looking at the third column, the lift coefficient, we do see a difference and an interesting one too. So the top three geometries, the ones with flat faces, have much lower lift coefficients than the bottom three, which have slanted fronts. That makes sense because the way the fronts are slanted in figure 1, they're effectively like cambered wings now, so they should produce a little more lift, and that's what they do. So these results tell us that a flat face is better for downforce than a typically slanted face with A-pillars. Another interesting point that stands out is that even for these three top geometries, which are symmetrical bodies, they're not slanted or anything, we still get downforce. And if they're symmetrical, then that should be closer to 0, that value, not minus 0.15 or minus 0.17. But the reason why we don't get 0 is because of this geometry's proximity to the ground. So in figure 3, we can see how close these geometries are to the ground. That's figure something, I don't know. Here we go, figure 3. And so the flow races underneath here and increases in speed, drops in pressure, and sucks the geometry down. So the downforce we saw is pretty much all from the underbody, and the authors don't actually give any pressure data for this, but I'm almost certain that that's because of why we're getting it. So that's pretty cool how putting a symmetric body close to the ground increases downforce. Just quickly, if you'd like us to simulate your very own car, let us know here. Now in figure 7, we see the time average wakes behind each body. They are very similar, and I can't really tell much of a difference between them. No trend really stands out. But the overall trend is the top vortices and vortex system is generally much more dominant than the bottom one. But in figure 9, we do see some differences now. So if I scroll down to figure 9, and if we look at the vortices around the side mirrors and how they evolve over time, we see that generally the geometry, with a slanted front have their vortices expand more as you go downstream. So you can see that these little white dashed lines. The top one is for the top vortex, the bottom one is for the bottom vortex, and the middle one is for the center line. So that's important because it will tell us how much they deviate in terms of angles, but the general size of these things tells us how far they've moved and how much they've expanded. So they also counter-rotating, that's one important point, because when we look at this wake, it makes sense as to why they would be spreading away from each other in the first place. If you apply potential theory, these vortices will be pushing each other away from each other and towards the surface. So that also explains why these vortices are stuck on the surface as you go downstream. That's just these vortices inducing each other in that way. Now in table 3, we see some numbers quantifying how much these vortices are angled and how strong they are at different points in the downstream sections. So I'm not sure how they calculated the strength of the vortices. I'm guessing that they integrated the closed loop circulation around them. Anyway. Honestly, there isn't too much of a difference in the strength between the different faces. They're all about the same, and I guess that's a little bit surprising. I was hoping that there'd be a little bit of differences, but there isn't here. But one trend that is clear is that as you go downstream, the vortices grow in strength, so they must be getting fed with circulation somewhere. So that's interesting how they are getting stronger, it seems. Another interesting thing is that's surprising is that there isn't much of a difference when you go look at the numbers. The general indication of the wakes in figure 9 indicated that maybe these voices for the slanted faces were getting stronger, but these numbers indicate that that's not the case. They are just getting stronger in general as you go downstream, all of them. So that's why numbers are important. But if we look at just what the impact of the mirrors are, so in figure 10, we see some very interesting results. So the color plots are for the pressure coefficient on the rear face of the bodies. And the gray, they can see like this gray metallic kind of thing. They are the isosurfaces of the pressure coefficients equaling minus 0.2. So that means that in this region, the pressure coefficient is minus 0.2 or lower. So effectively it tells us what the wake is in this region, the size of it. And on the side of the geometry that does have a mirror, so this WM side, the left side, you can see that the gray isosurface is larger and the rear face has more green and even blue. So that means that the pressure coefficient is lower here. That's bad for drag. That means usually more pressure drag. On the side of the geometry without a mirror, so the right side here, the rear face is seeing even red coloring and the region of minus 0.2 for the pressure coefficient is much smaller. That means that we're probably getting a less pressure drag on this side. and that's telling us that the mirrors are creating a larger wake. But let's now look at some numbers to quantify the drag exactly and overall the drag. So in table 2, we have some numbers showing how much drag there is from these mirrors. So in the the rightmost 3 columns, we see some numbers quantifying the drag based on whether this is a side mirror or not. So the CDWM is the drag coefficient with a side mirror. The CDWM dash is without. And you can clearly see that constantly without no side mirror, we get lower drag coefficients than with the side mirror. So this second column is consistently lower than the third column from the right. And in the rightmost column, we see the percentage drop. And we're seeing between 4% and 9% drops when you remove the side mirrors in the quantity here. So figure 10 is showing that the wake is much larger when you attach a side mirror, and the drag increases, which is probably because a lot to do with the pressure drag. We get much lower pressure on these faces, and that's going to be pulling the car back. And after seeing that, I'm very tempted to shoot off my side mirrors to reduce the drag of the car. And that is one takeaway message. If you want to take off your side mirrors, one option is to shoot them off. Now, in figure 11 here, we see the isosurfaces for the Q criterion equaling 1001 on second squared. In other words, where the vortices are. And they're colored in the velocity. Now, before we get into the vortices from the side mirrors, which are plentiful, I just want to look at figure 11b, so this middle left figure. We see on the top, vortices are created from the start. And that doesn't occur on any other geometry. And that is almost certainly bad for both the drag and noise production. But anyway, for the mirrors, as we saw earlier in figure 9, the 3 slanted bodies have the vortices growing, but not in strength, just in space. The 3 left geometries have the vortices from the mirrors staying in a little closer space, not that close, but a little closer. So we're seeing the same thing happening here. And these vortices in general, and how they're breaking down, really suggests that there will be a lot of noise coming from them, but not in the exact same way. So the small stuff will likely be producing just general broadband noise, while the larger structures will likely be producing major tonal noise. But let's see. So in figure 14, if we scroll down there, we see the frequency spectrum and the decibels produced there. It's a bit of a mess, so let's explain what's going on. First of all, each plot is for a different position on the side window. The exact position is given by the cross in the bottom left of each plot. Then in each plot, we have all 6 geometries plotted. The legend is in the top left plot for the different geometries, but effectively the blues, the light blue, dark blue, and green, and the yellow, they're for the slants. The like brownie, green, and red are for the flat faces. And from all of this, the authors really only noted that in positions 18 and 25, so the bottom middle and bottom right plots, there are major differences between these geometries. These differences are that first, the bodies without A pillars slightly have lower values here across the spectrum, so they likely have less noise. The second difference is that with the slanted bodies, so the ones with A pillars, they see the original 40 Hz tonal noise shifted by 3 to 4 Hz across the 6 different positions shown here, and it seems to be an increase. So that means that the tonal noise that we saw with the flat faces, which were 40 Hz and 80 Hz, they're being shifted up a little bit. They're becoming a tiny bit higher. And they attribute this shift, the authors attribute the shift to the slanted fronts altering the horseshoe vortex that forms around the front. The flat faces have a typical one, while the slanted faces have that, but then it's warped a little bit. So that's the one difference between these 2 different configurations, the slight difference in tonal noise. Now in figure 15, we see something really cool. So this is how the noise is radiated away from the body at 0.9 meters away in the top left, 1.35 meters in the top right, and 1.8 meters in the bottom figure. This is really cool because it shows where you are around the front of the car. So here at 270 degrees on the plot, for the top figure here, that the sound here is radiated the smallest amount. So what this means is that if you want to reduce how much you're hearing, you should go in front of the car. Anywhere else in this top left plot, you're getting higher decibels. And it increases as you go from around underneath at the front, the top at the front, and at the back. They're the 3 bad regions. But when you go further away from the car, So the next two plots, the sound becomes much more uniform and it matters less and less where you are around the car. So in those figures, the differences between the different configurations are pretty much nothing now. Only at the 0.6 meter away location are the decent differences between the different locations, between different geometries, sorry. The standout to me is the GB body, which is really just the block with very minor rounding on the front edges. That has a small amount of noise here, and noticeably. You can see this magenta line, how it's much closer to the body, so that means that the decibel values are much lower. So this block plowing through the air produces less noise than the other ones, which are arguably potentially more streamlined. That's quite interesting. Now the SB body, which is a slanted body, but just a wedge really, has arguably the worst noise reduction because at about 30 degrees around, the noise here is worse. So even though it's pretty similar around the rest of the body, at 30 degrees, it's really plumped up a lot more. So overall, the noise from it is the worst here. All the rest of the geometries have somewhat similar productions with only minor differences cropping in. And with that, we come to this podcast. It's quite interesting how these geometries affected the noise, and in an unexpected way. I didn't expect the really blunt one to be the best here, and I didn't expect the slanted ones to be really that much worse. But anyway, that's a takeaway message. And if you liked this podcast, hit the me likey and subscribe buttons. And if you want to learn OpenFOAM, then check out our courses below. And if you want us to simulate your very own car, let us know in the link below too. And if you're staying on YouTube, it thinks you like this video, so check it out. Peace out, amigos.